For me, the biggest sign that God was real was after praying that prayer the second time, that complete desire for drugs just left me. And I can tell you, maybe in 16 years, I've never had a desire to put a pin in my arm again, pick up a crack pipe to use again. For me, at that moment in time, was the biggest miracle.
Welcome everybody, this is Simon Gilbo with Inspired. It's great to be back with you this week. I've got another fantastic guest. I'm super excited. Inspired is all about stirring faith. It's gritty stories of overcoming despite horrific circumstances in life. It's about bringing hope amidst so many grim stories to tell some good news of God breaking in. So this week we have Trudy Makepeace with us. Welcome, Trudy.
Thank you, Simon. Great to be with you.
And Trudy has got a book out. It's called Abused, Addicted, Free, the true story of Trudy Makepeace. And she'll be telling that in a moment. In Burundi, I've got a fair experience of working with what was Trudy's story, which is ending up in the parlours and prostitution and the crack addiction and all sorts of stuff. Out there, so many ladies almost have to engage in it because there's so much poverty. So we have a number of projects. We work alongside these ladies. One time I actually hired out 2 ladies for a night that completely, I didn't want it to be a stunt, but we prayed, Lord, give us 2 young girls and who clearly want to get out of it. And these 2 girls came along. Their names are Doreen and Ida, and they came to a hotel and completely unsuspecting, but it was beautiful. I showed up and my friend Cosette had helped me line them up. And then we sat down at the table. They obviously dolled up and expecting to be on the job. And I said, ladies, listen, I just want you to have a night off. You stuff your face, enjoy a hot shower. It's a very poor country. They don't have hot showers. And the only condition is please don't solicit business from anyone else. And I'll come back in the morning. And, if you want a new sort of start in life, let's see what we can do. And I went back and prayed with my wife, Lizzie. And then obviously they were a bit nonplussed. But the next day I went back. And of course, what was their story? Were they like my daughter, age 5, thinking, when I grow up, I want to be a prostitute? Of course not. It's that they'd fallen through the cracks. They were orphans. They were trying to provide for their 6 siblings. There was so much pain and brokenness. And that is every lady's story, pretty much, I think, that ends up as a working girl. It's not something they wanted to do. They are victims of stuff way beyond their control. The lovely conclusion to Doreen and Ida's story is that we got them back into the studies. They finished their degree. Doreen is now married to a pastor. They've got 2 healthy children. And Ida, she's still single, but we set her up in business and she's absolutely thriving. So that's just a lovely ending to that story and their ongoing journey. I also ended up working in Germany with the Salvation Army in the red light district and had lots of encounters there. And I suppose all the more why I wanted to hear Trudy's story is that, I only had 6 months working in the red light district in Hamburg. It's called the Reeperbahn. It was such a dark place and there was so much brokenness. And I'll be honest with you, there were so few stories of breakthroughs. It was hard yards. We didn't have many encouragements. And yet we all need hope. And I cannot think of a darker story in a sense than Trudy's, and yet she's come through. My connection with Trudy comes from my trustee, Rosie Hopley, who is a mutual friend. I know, Trudy, you're now on her board of the work that she was doing with Beloved in Bristol. And also, actually, it was Nigel Ring who gave me your book. And Nigel's a mutual friend as well. And so, listen, Trudy, I think, from the get-go in your book, you talk the first chapter, literally, you recount how you were raped. And it's very meaty. You don't hold back in sharing your story. And I think it's holy ground. And I don't want to sort of interrupt your flow. So in a sense, I want to introduce you now and just let you go. Just tell your story and I'll come back at the end. So welcome again, Trudy Makepeace. You go for it. And I'll come back later. Go for it.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. I'm a bit like you. I've worked with women abroad in helping them as well, try to facilitate raising finance in a different way to provide for themselves due to pressures like poverty, like you say, growing up without parents and just not having no stability there. So yeah, I feel like we're a bit of kindred spirits there. For me personally, it's been in Rwanda and Uganda and in India, actually, just buying women out of prostitution. But I suppose the heart and the passion obviously comes from my story. And yeah, definitely for me, you just mentioned the book, and just to highlight that again, I've just written my story in a bit called Abused, Addicted, Free. And I guess I'm just going to start by recapping a little bit on that opening chapter as you've mentioned it. And yeah, just begin to unpack and share some of the story, how that came to be. And like you said, what Jesus has done. But yeah, so it was approximately 19 and a half years ago that I found myself, yeah, like you said, just being raped on the streets. I'd picked up a client early hours of the morning, and he just turned out to be a nasty piece of work. And I just recall really having the blade to my throat and just thinking, I've got to get out here and have a fix. There's no way that I am leaving this situation without having a fix. And, you know, in that situation, I ended up robbing the guy with my hand in his back pocket as he was raping me and holding a knife to my throat. And, you know, when I look back on that now, I think, wow, do you know, it would have took a split second. Even in the moment, I knew it would take a split second and it would all be over. But I didn't care in that moment because all I could think about was getting my next fix. You see, I'd been an addict for so long from my teens, and I don't know how long I'd been addicted at that point. But at that point, I was just in the throes of addiction, and working the streets and selling my body was the norm. You know, when I think back of how that all started, you know, how I ended up there, well, it was quite a journey, really. And I think, you know, growing up for me played a big part in that. My early years really helped really form and shape my values, how I saw myself, how I saw the world around me. And so, you know, if I was to take you back there now, just to help you understand how I ended up selling my body on a street corner, how I ended up in that line of work and so ruthlessly addicted to drugs. I was addicted to crack cocaine and heroin. I was an addict for 18 years and I was out of control. But how did I get there? I guess, like I said, it just in the early years, I think I was about 4 when I first discovered that I was adopted. And yeah, really at that time on discovering that news, I didn't really know how to process that. And I remember sharing that news with my adopted mom, and she was just outraged, actually. And she just lashed out at me and she just walloped me and sent me flying across the floor. And I just remember in that moment thinking, there must be something wrong with me. Like, I was silenced, really, you know, and I just remember the shock of that moment. And it might not seem so significant, but it was significant because what I learned at a very young age was there was something wrong with me. There was something wrong with who I was. I wasn't ever to talk about it again. And just the shock of the whole thing and just this sense of shame. I wouldn't have been able to identify it as shame then, but just came over me. And then I was sexually abused from the age of 5 into my early teens by numerous different people. And obviously that once again just compounded the feeling of shame about who I was. Out of that, I ended up just really believing those lies that it was my fault, that I was inherently bad, you know, that I was damaged goods. You know, both of these instances really started to shape how I saw myself, and just the fear around any reaction or response I would get. I just kept it all in, and I internalized all that stuff. And I just grew up really, just with the sense that I didn't belong, I didn't fit. There was something wrong with me. And I just became really a victim at the hand of so many different predators. It was almost as though I felt like I must have victim written on my forehead, like an invitation to come. You know, little did I realize then, you know, how real the enemy is and how he gets to work in somebody's life quite young and just begins to sow those lies and just that sense of fear as well, fear of speaking out and not feeling free to do that. It was almost like I was constrained and imprisoned even from a young age. So the reason that's so important is because obviously all of that shaped my value. I had no concept of value for myself. as the story unfolds, that is so really, really, really evident. And then, I went on. Life was, I suppose, challenging. Like most of us have different challenges in different ways. We were poor growing up. I was one of five. I was the eldest. There was, it was physical abuse, emotional abuse. Just like I said, abuse from different people related to the family, and just all that kind of stuff going on. So I grew up really quite introvert, feeling quite isolated, disconnected, like I didn't belong, didn't fit. From a very early age, I began to find ways to escape my reality. Like, with so much sadness and brokenness on the inside that I was unable to articulate, talk about, or process. So I began to just seek ways to escape, really. I guess, what do you do with trauma when you're so small? You just cope in the best way that you can. Long story short, I ended up just starting to run. I ran away a number of times. I tried to take my own life on several occasions. And I was just riddled with anxiety and fear. And, it's hard enough growing up. But I think my world at that time, like, it was imploding on the inside. I thought if I could get out of that situation, I would be okay. I thought if I could get out, but I had no idea where I was running to or what I was running to. I was just running blind. After a couple of occasions and attempts on my life, I ended up going into to the care of the social services. Once again, just this whole distorted perspective that I had of myself led to a eating disorder, self-harming, and just was really, really difficult. So I left there at 14 and was in the care of social services, started to see psychologists, counsellors, really just to kind of deal with some of the trauma that had happened in my childhood. But what I found at that age, it was like opening a can of worms, and it just began to become so overwhelming and all-consuming. And then on one occasion, my psychologist left, and that was it. I never went back, and I had all of this stuff that had kind of started to come to the surface now that I had pushed down, that I had learned to cope with in my own way. And now I was really battling with this overwhelming sense of not being able to cope with it all or process it. I remember thinking if I got away from that house, life would be better. And even my best friend at the time thought, why are you not doing better now you're not in that situation? But all of a sudden, all that stuff on the inside just started to rise up. And as much as I wanted to kind of do the right thing and kind of move forward and be positive, I was overwhelmed with all these emotions and still was finding ways to escape, really. And I suppose that's when I first got introduced to soft drugs and just got in with the wrong crowd, and really once again just looking to be loved and to be accepted. The most fundamental human need that we have is to be loved. To be loved is to know that you matter, is to know that you're significant, and it's to know that you're valued. And I suppose at my core, really, that's what I was looking for: love, acceptance, and belonging. And I just gravitated to the wrong places where I was accepted and where I was welcomed. And it was there I really began to start smoking marijuana, started taking acid and speed. And like I said, I began battling with an eating disorder, and just things started spiraling out of control quite quickly, really. I think there was also that rebellious side of my nature as well that had started to rise up. And deep within me, I still had this sense that I would sort myself out, that I had a chance. And I did have a chance in the sense of I was no longer in that situation. But actually, the way I viewed the world and myself, and the way that I was coping with things became really, really problematic. I attempted more suicide attempts because really I ended up just finding myself going in a direction I didn't really want to go, but I was too weak really in character. And so I ended up really getting into codependent relationships as well. That became a bit of a thing for me, really. And it was easy for me to love others with a broken kind of love, but I had no love or sense of worth for myself. I kind of overcompensated by, I suppose, loving others, but not always in a way that was helpful, really.
Hmm.
But I would overcompensate, really. Yeah, things just began to escalate from there, really. Like I say, I started off on those soft drugs. I quickly became addicted to amphetamines for about, I don't know, just over 5 years. They say that after taking amphetamines for 5 years, you're clinically mad. And I can certainly say that through my journey, I certainly had some psychotic episodes and some real meltdowns. And I always think like I was really fortunate not to be labeled, with any mental health disorders, because actually there was, obviously through using drugs, I think back now, and I remember coming down off speed on one occasion and visiting my doctor, and he said to me, "You are 18 years of problems," and referred me to a psychiatrist. And I remember thinking, I am not going there. I do not want to get sectioned or anything like that. So I managed to duck and dive that, really. But yeah, many times I would be up for weeks at a time, hallucinating, hearing voices. I remember running through the town on one occasion, and this kind of desire and urge rising up on me to curse people. And I'd been up for so long and had so much drugs in me. It was almost like that this kind of devilish thing had kind of started to rise up in me. And I know now as a Christian that I had opened the door really to demonic influence in my life. And wow, I just remember that, and lots of episodes like that. I ended up moving on to heroin and crack cocaine. Like I said, I was addicted for 18 years, and ended up in all kinds of situations. I lived on the streets for 6 years. I was working the streets as a working girl. I worked the parlors. And if you get my story, if you get my book, you can just see it, like it just progresses, and it just seems to spiral more and more out of control. And within all of that, there was a lot of violence. Getting arrested was an occupational hazard for me. Spending the night in the cells, and getting locked up, going to prison. And just when you think things couldn't get worse, they would seem to just get worse. And like I said, a number of times I was raped or took hostage or held against my will, and in all kinds of crazy situations. And it's only by the grace and the mercy of God that I'm alive to tell this story today. When I reflect back and some of those situations, I know, that it's the hand of the Lord upon me. Yeah, I think all of that really stemmed from those early wounds in my life, and those lies that were sowed, and that perspective I had just made it easy for me to go along this road. And it was almost like as well that there was a sense of powerlessness so often that I seemed to exhibit, really. For example, I would want to sort myself out. I'd want to get better. I would want to, and I would have this kind of bit of grit and determination. But so often, even though I would try my best, so often I would end up back in this kind of place of oppression and sense of powerlessness. That all of that came about and was birthed through those early years of being sexually abused.
Yeah.
When you actually, in those situations, there is a sense of powerlessness, and you are. But what happens then is it's like you go through life and you don't even realize it. But it's almost like that renders you powerless, even in other situations as you go on in life. And really just ended up in the gutter. People would look at me and just think, there's no hope for that one. Like I said, I wouldn't sleep for weeks at a time. And, me and some of my partners nearly literally killed each other. Our relationships were really fueled with violence in the end. There was so much, hurt, so much resentment, so much anger. And, how we never literally killed each other or ended up in prison for one another, again, it was just by the mercy and the grace of God. I remember coming so close to just setting my partner alight, really, in a situation. And I mean, I was so desensitized. I recall another situation. We were been squatting for a few years and in different places. And we were in this burnt out old building. And I remember it was a big building. It was an old nursing home, and the place had caught fire. And, the whole place was a fire trap. And I remember my partner screaming at me as I was taking a pipe to get out of the building before it blew. But all I could think about was my next fix, and I'd have a fix, and then I'd want my next one, and then I'd have a next one, and then I'd want my next one. I was so out of control, so desensitized to any kind of danger whatsoever. And by the grace of God, we did get out of there in one piece. But I mean, I was so obsessed that my addiction began to literally possess me. I mean, drugs already changed the way our minds work. And that's why sometimes you can look at a drug addict and you can think, well, why can't they just sort themselves out? But drugs really alters the way the mind works, the way it registers pain and pleasure. And, it really does start to affect the neural pathways as well. And I just remember, I'd got so out of control. I remember my partner once, you've heard of men putting women on the street. I was screaming and trying to get me off the street. I mean, I was relentless. I would say that I had obsessed over drugs for so long, and I had used them as a form of escapism, and that I'd got to a point where they possessed me. When you obsess over something long enough, it ends up possessing you. And I would say that was definitely where I found myself. And really, even when I reflect back now, I think I had lost hope, even way before that point. And I think when you lose hope and you give up on yourself, it's a dangerous place to be, especially as an addict. Anything goes. And just, when you think you can't go any lower, you do. So yeah, like I said, I was 33 actually. I'd reached the age of 33, and that was really a pivotal moment of change, because up until that point, I always believed that one day I would sort myself out. One day I would fix up. And, I did have a lot of grit. I did have a lot of determination. And, I'd worked jobs in between all of that. I'd managed to get jobs for short periods of time because I'd had a work ethic from a young girl, because actually, even with my dad, I was working cleaning jobs as a youngster. That was one good thing that came out of my family. Like I knew what it was to work. So I'd had these periods where I would get up and I would say, right, that's it, I'm going to sort myself out. And I would go for a little while. I might get a job. I might do all right for a couple of months and just really focus and begin to make some progress.
Hey folks, I hope you're enjoying the podcast. I'm loving the response we're getting from across the world. It's just wonderful to see how encouraging and inspiring it is being and hitting the spot. Listen, if you are being blessed by it, I'd love it. Basically, this happens under the auspices of our ministry, Great Lakes Outreach, which works in the poorest and the hungriest country in the world, which is Burundi. We're having an incredible impact in the toughest of circumstances. We want to carry on supporting those local folks doing a great job. So if you wanted to, greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. You could make a donation there. I'd so appreciate it. Also, it's word of mouth, isn't it? So gossip these podcasts to other people, get them to subscribe, give us a great review. Absolutely wonderful. So grateful to you. So that's greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. If you want to do a monthly, a couple of quid a month, or a one-off donation, we'd be incredibly grateful. All right, now let's get back to the podcast.
At the age of 33, all in all, I can tell you it was 33 times that I had attempted to detox, to sort myself out.
Wow.
I had done that through going abroad, all kinds of detoxes, lofexidone, methadone, DF118s, you name it, I tried it. I mean, even once I detoxed in a dungeon, in a brothel, you name it. So it wasn't that I didn't have the grit at certain times. There were times when I went for it, but I just couldn't sustain it. I was too weak. I would just buckle. I think the longest time I went was when I went into a rehab for about 5 months and moved to Bath. And it wasn't long before I ended up in Bristol and back where I started, actually even worse. But so after 33 times, I think in all of that time, I'd always believed one day I will fix me. One day I will sort it out, because I was a survivor. I had survived this long, and I believed I could do it. But after those 33 failed attempts, I mean, I seriously lost hope. I mean, I talked about losing hope before, but this was something else. I'd got to a point really where I kind of almost resigned myself to the fact this was it. This was my lot in life. That there was no hope for me. And the Bible says that when we lose hope, our hearts become sick. Well, I mean, I had been pushing stuff down inside for so long. You can only push stuff down for so long. It always finds its way up and out. And, that was really beginning to happen for me. And even prior to that instance, I'd gone into a number of different rehabs, and one of them was a Christian rehab in South Wales. I recall one time I was in St. Paul's, and I collapsed on the nuns' doorstep. They run a project called Fishes and Lives. I collapsed on their doorstep, and, a long story short, I ended up through them in a home in South Wales that belonged to a ministry called Victory Outreach. And I recall the nun, she was one of the nuns, she was about 4 foot, and then there was a couple of others, and literally carrying me up almost a 90-degree hill. I mean, this big steep hill. I was 5 stone nothing, and here are these lovely ladies like carting me up into the rehab, carrying me in there. I was there a few weeks and I ran off, and but I recall when I was there I remember thinking to myself, where am I? These people watch the news, they watch TV, they drink cups of tea, and they sit around talking, and I was so alien to my lifestyle. Like, I was just like, what planet are they on? I was 250 miles an hour. I was like a whirlwind. And, I didn't sleep. I didn't rest. I didn't watch the news and drink tea. And I just thought, where on earth am I? But I remember seeing something different in these people. At the time, I couldn't really identify what it was, but I remember running off from there, and another drug overdose, and things spiraled out of control even more. My life was in ruins, and I would say, like, I was broken in 1,000 pieces beyond repair. And like I said, it was a few years later, actually, that I encountered the nuns again, and they talked me into going back to this Christian rehab. And finally I did end up going back, but I was there a few weeks, and I was actually bailed there as well, and then obviously waiting for my court case. But while I was there, I was taken to a meeting, a Christian meeting. I'd never been to a meeting like this before. It was in St. David's Hall in Cardiff, and I remember getting in there, and it was a great big hall. I think it seats about 20,000 people in there, and it was plush elevators, plush red carpet. And anyway, we got in there, the women and the men from the rehab, and it was just a real buzz about the place. I didn't really know what to expect. And then there was some music, and so some worship music. And at the time, I was like swinging my hips in the air like I just didn't care. And everybody was looking at me thinking, yeah, she's the new girl. You can tell she's the new one in. And, I was giving it my all. And then then this man came out, and evangelist Reinhard Bonnke. Well, I didn't know who he was at the time, and he came out, and he began to speak, and I just remember being captivated by him, and just like this sense of just God in the room, and just like he spoke with such an authority, and I just remember the joy, because there was a big screen and you could see his face on the screen, just this joy in his eyes and this kind of sparkle. And I just remember being just kind of a bit mesmerized by it all. And I can't remember the message particularly, or much of what he said, other than he said that, that I was a sinner and I needed forgiveness. Well, you didn't need to tell me I was a sinner. I knew I was a sinner. And anyway, I don't remember the whole of the message, but I remember him saying, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whosoever would believe on him should not perish, but have everlasting life." And that I could know God's forgiveness and reconciliation with God. And at the time, like I said, I don't think I fully grasped it, but in my heart, I knew I needed to respond. And I remember running down to the front, receiving prayer, receiving Jesus at that time. But it was a response to what was going on in my heart. And I remember as I went down the front, just this sense of expectation, real expectation. And I mean, I didn't even know what God felt like, but I felt him in that moment. I knew he was close. And somebody laid their hands on my head and prayed for me in the name of Jesus. And I just felt this surge of heat going through my body. And I remember afterwards, as they were directing us into another room, like I was just walking on air. And I remember coming back from that meeting with this sense of my life will never be the same again. Well, I got back to the rehab. I was there, I don't know, less than 2 weeks. And I had a bit of a payout, and the temptation to go and run off and use overtook me. I ran off. I ran back to my old haunt, and ended up basically back on the streets for a month. And in this moment, I can say that it was bizarre, because I'd been in far more dangerous situations, far bleaker situations. But right now, it was like the sense of hopelessness, and the realization I couldn't get high. Like I was using, and it was like I just couldn't escape anymore. It was like, oh my goodness, I didn't understand what was going on. And I think it was at that moment I had this real realization that this was it. This was my life, that I couldn't fix me. You see, up to that point, I always thought I'd do it. One day I'll do it. I'll fix me one day. But in this moment, I realized I couldn't. And that was a really hopeless, like my heart just sank. I think it was the day after, or that day, that I made my way to Portland Square to work the streets. And I got picked up by the police, and obviously I was wanted because I'd breached my bail. Ended up back in the jail, back there. And I remember Victory Outreach contacting me while I was in there. They'd obviously found out, the word on the street had got around, and they'd found out that I was back in there. So somebody rang me and spoke to me with the invitation to come back. Well, I didn't want to go back, really. For me, it was a place of confinement. But interestingly enough, actually, I do recall when I was on the streets, that before I got arrested, I knew I needed to get back, and that I would be a part of something in the future. But now here I was with the opportunity to go back, and I was like wrestling with that whole thing. And I remember being queued up in the cell with a girl, and I remember there was a scriptural calendar on the wall, and I remember being drawn to reading it, and I started to read it, and what that is a calendar with different Bible verses on. And I remember just reading that and sharing it with the girl that was in the bed opposite, and almost preaching it up, but didn't even know what I was talking about. But as I was reading it and I was sharing it, I felt like I was coming alive in me. And just there were some shifts and some changes that I started to recognize now that everything else was stripped away. I remember going to the chapel, and I remember thinking to myself as I came out of there, why are you questioning myself, why I'd got so upset about a girl who was being rude in there? whilst the chaplain was talking. And, this kind of sense of righteous indignation had arisen in me. And I remember thinking, what's all that about? Like, why am I so bothered about that? In fact, I even pulled the girl when we come out to say, how disrespectful that was. Well, that wouldn't have bothered me before. So there was these things that were starting to change on the inside of me. You see, what it was, Simon, I had prayed a prayer to receive Christ, and he had begun a work in my heart, only it was taking me a while to catch up with what was going on. And this shift that was happening in me, this kind of, this just a shift and this awareness of God. And even in my cell, I remember thinking, I don't want to go back to Victory, but it was almost like, it was really surreal. Now I know it's the flesh, what we would call the flesh, and my spirit man. But at the time, it was like this invisible wall, almost like I wanted to do what I want to do, but I knew that there was just this wall there. And yeah, it was just that. It was just my desire, and yet God's desire. And little did I realize in that moment, God was trying to bring me into a place of freedom. My idea of freedom was doing what I wanted, when I wanted, how I wanted, with who I wanted. Little did I realize that would actually lead me into places of confinement and into different the prison of addiction, doing what I wanted when I wanted. But here was God now, whilst I was in prison, really wanting to lead me out into a place of real freedom. Anyway, I ended up saying yes to going back to Victory Outreach if the court would permit me. I went to court, they heard my case, they said, we're going to give you 6 months to prove yourself. You can go back, and we're going to have you back in 6 months for sentencing. And it was a real wrestle, but I went back, and it was while I was there actually, and I was detoxing, I've been there for a while, that one of the girls gave me a copy of the Father's love letter. If you don't know it, Google it, look it up. Yeah, I mean, for me, it was a real another defining moment, because I remember taking it up to my attic room. I was in the attic room on my own, and I remember picking it up, and it starts and it opens with, my child, I know everything about you. I know when you rise, when you sit down, when you stand up. I know every hair that is numbered on your head. I know every single thought. I know your thoughts from afar off. There's nothing that I don't know about you. And it just continues just to really talk about God's love as a father. Now, I'd never known my biological father, and I'd always had a yearning to know my biological father. And I love how Jesus meets us personally. Individuals. And for me, here he was in this moment, beginning to reveal himself as my heavenly Father. And as I continued to read about how he'd been misunderstood, misrepresented, and how that he'd given Jesus, his beloved son, for us, so that we could have not just know forgiveness of sins, but that we could know his plan and his purpose for our lives. And just how he wasn't holding my mistakes against me. Now, you've got to understand where I'd been, what I'd done, who I'd done it with. And here was God offering me a new start, a fresh start, forgiveness, and a relationship with him. And I remember reading this, and I remember coming to close to the end, and just that invitation again to know Christ as my Savior, but to know God as my Father. And I remember reading it, and I just remember feeling like I have found what I'd always been looking for, but never knew that I was even looking. And I just had this sense of I'd come home. It was bizarre. It was like that was how I had found what I'd always been looking for, but didn't know I was looking. And that I just felt this sense of love. Like, as I read it, my heart really connected in that moment and just opened up to God as my Father. And it just, my heart just burst open. And I remember praying that prayer again to receive Jesus as my Savior, and, accepting that God wanted a relationship with me. And I remember praying that prayer this time with my whole heart. And this time, not just with my heart, but with my understanding. I think the first time I prayed that prayer, I prayed it, yeah, genuinely. And God, I was born again. But this time I was praying the prayer. I was praying with my understanding. And, in John 8:32 says, and you shall know that Jesus says, you shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free. But I think to the degree that we understand the truth is a degree in which we will walk in freedom. And for me in this moment, I really understood. And this was pivotal because now my response on the back of that, I understood what I needed to do as a response to that. I remember praying that prayer whole heart and saying, yeah, Lord, I have made a mess of things. I knew I couldn't fix me. I had to reach the end of myself. I had to reach a point of hopelessness, actually, for me to begin to open up to this invitation. And I remember thinking for a moment, am I being brainwashed? But I knew in my heart. I mean, there's a knowing, there's an inner knowing, it's an inner witness with our spirit. And I remember just saying, right, that's it. And I remember getting on my knees with all my heart and just asking for God's forgiveness, for Jesus to wash me clean, to forgive me and to come and make his home in my heart. And that I wanted this relationship, like it was all I had and I was all in. And I think there is something about the degree to which we surrender as well. And in that moment, I surrendered everything. I had nothing. And it was just everything. And I prayed that prayer. Now, for me, what was incredible was, now, not only had I experienced this sense of love and coming home, like belonging, connecting. Now, I never belonged. I knew what it was to be adopted. So I had some concept of being adopted now into God's family. But I just remember all of a sudden after that prayer, just feeling like a few significant things. The first thing was I had a peace. I had this peace. Now, I never knew how restless and anxious I was until I experienced the peace that was like something I'd never known. And this love and this sense of acceptance and belonging. I felt like a virgin again. I felt like I'd had, when you've had a beautiful hot bath and you get out after you're filthy dirty, I felt like that on the inside. Who could do that? I love that the Bible says, that the blood of Jesus cleanses us from all sin, all unrighteousness. And here I was, before I even had ever heard that, really, having this experience of it. And I remember looking around the room thinking, where's my guilt? Where's my shame? It was like this big, like I knew I was free from guilt. I don't even know how I knew. It was just, again, it was just God revealing it. And I remember thinking, well, that's not right. Like, where's it gone? Like, I mean, just trying to get my head around that. But I think in all of that, one of the biggest witnesses to me over the days was that Christ had really set me free from my addiction. You see, although I'd been born again already and I was in the rehab, I was still an addict. I had the mindset of an addict. I was still on Valium and, I was down to hardly anything. And I still had that mindset. But I remember after that day, like completely being set free. And for me, that was the biggest miracle in that moment. For now, me looking back, I know it was salvation. But for me, the biggest sign that God was real was after praying that prayer the second time, the complete desire for drugs just left me. And I can tell you, it's like, how long now? It's 16 years, coming on 16 years or so. I've never had a desire to put a pin in my arm again, pick up a crack pipe to use again. For me, that was it. After 33 failed attempts and just relentless, not being able to break free. For me, that at that moment in time was the biggest miracle.
Wonderful.
That Jesus, in a moment, had set me free. It was just incredible. And then really from there, I've just gone on an incredible journey over the next 16 years. I'm going to stop there because I feel like I've talked a lot and I don't know how much time I've got.
Great. So that was 16 years ago. Quickly, as time's running out, how have the last 16 years been?
It's incredible, really. So, yeah, I spent a number of years in the rehab. I ended up becoming the manager of the rehab, which was ironic and such a miracle because I couldn't manage my little finger. So how God did that and turned it around for good. I used to go into the prisons. Now I have work in a church in Bristol, and I'm a minister, outreach and evangelism minister there, and I'm also itinerant, so I do a lot of traveling, missions, and sharing my story, ministering in prisons, ministering in different churches and contexts. So yeah, God has been incredible how he has just taken it really and turned it around for good.
Wonderful, Trudy. I've got a smile on my face because it's such a testimony of hope. A few weeks ago, I was on the streets in Bath and I was talking to Antoinette, and she would have been a bit like you, and yet she's still in that place. She was 35. She's already a grandmother. She told me about how she'd been raped umpteen times from her childhood, and she was just so hopeless, and she couldn't believe that God could love her. And yet, if I had your book in my hand, I would give it to her. And actually, that's the sort of thing we want to do, isn't it? I know you've had hundreds, is it 800 and something books? You've already got into prisons for these ladies that might seem completely hopeless in their cells. And I know that's one of the things actually we'd like to happen out of this podcast. Folks, if you resonate with Trudy's story, or if you just want other precious broken ladies to be offered that gift of hope, the plan is to buy 5 or buy 10 or buy 50 or whatever books. And Trudy, through her ministry, will be able to get those into prisons. So take this down, or you can look at it in the blurb, info@trudymakepeace.com. That's Trudy with a Y. info@trudymakepeace.com, or www.trudymakepeace.com. And there you can get her book. The book's called Abused, Addicted, Free, The True Story of Trudy Makepeace. And that ministry in prison is so powerful. And I read that book, and it was a real page turner. I mean, as you can imagine, and you'll want to read it quickly, and then you'll want to pass it on. Very well written for people that are not familiar with faith, purposefully done that way. So listen, Trudy, it's been a real privilege. I thank you I know it's tiring, and I know it takes something out of you each time you dig deep to share that, but God bless you so much. I am cheering you on in your ministry. Love what you're doing. And I hope everyone's been inspired. So listen, if you have been inspired and you've enjoyed it, please gossip this podcast to someone else. So give us a great review on iTunes or Spotify. If you want to be in touch with me, it's simongilbert.com and the other social media platforms. But Trudy, thank you so much. God bless you loads.
Yeah, bless you, Simon. Thank you.
Wonderful. And to all you folks, see you next week with another fantastic guest. Toodaloo.